PAFI. And as soon as he finishes, he will invite Shri Shringla to give his address, after which we will have Virat Bhatia, the Vice President of PAFI, moderate a session and wind up. PAFI Dialogue is our endeavor in PAFI to bring senior bureaucrats, thinkers, industrialists to promote transparency in public policy space. And we are delighted to have a record participation, as I said. Shri Shringla, we have serving diplomats, ambassadors, former diplomats, CEOs, PAFI members, of course, policymakers, government officials, international organizations, educational institutions, think tank, industry bodies, so on and so forth. So you have a very large cross-section of audience today. And before I invite Shubho to give a formal welcome, I want to thank Apple on record for their support in organizing this program, and to Virat. Over to you, Shubho. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khanna. Sir, on behalf of all our members, a very warm welcome, and we are very proud that you're with us today. PAFI started, sir, about in 2008 as a very informal platform for some of us public policy professionals. In 2018, we formally registered ourselves under the Societies Act. And today we have about 70 members representing different sections of the industry. Our core function, sir, is to encourage and drive ethical, transparent, and evidence-based discussion and conversations between policymakers, industry, academia, and media with a view to maximize economic growth for our citizens and our country. For this year, sir, post-pandemic, we deliberated quite a bit, and we have decided on a theme which is reviving the economy. And this broad theme, sir, is encapsulated in 3 key words: reboot, reimagine, and reform. Because we believe unless we are able to dramatically and radically rethink and reimagine, post-COVID global growth in economy will not be possible. And we are very, very fortunate, sir. You were the inaugural speaker for this theme today. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Shringla took charge as the Foreign Secretary of India in January 2020. Immediately prior to that, he was India's ambassador to the United States. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1984. His formidable achievements in diplomacy are well matched by his erudite scholarship and his enthusiasm for sports. So with your permission, I would like to bring to everybody's notice your interest in mountaineering specifically, and you have been to the Everest base camp. That's a great achievement, sir. He's an alumnus of the Mayo and St. Stephen College. He has also been conferred an honorary D.Litt degree. Please join me. Today he's going to speak on a very, very relevant topic, which is India's foreign policy in the post-COVID world, new vulnerabilities, new opportunities. Please join me in welcoming the Foreign Secretary of India, Mr. Vardhan Shringla. Sir, the floor is yours.
Namaskar and good evening. Let me begin by thanking the Public Affairs Forum of India for inviting me to speak on India's foreign policy in these somewhat unusual times. I want to thank Shri Shubho Ray, for his president, for his very kind introduction. Virat Bhatia, Vice President, and my good friend and co-founder of PAFI, Ajay Khanna, for hosting me this evening. We meet in the shadow of the pandemic that has changed the course of contemporaries. It has been a period of extraordinary stresses and shocks. We've been affected by an exceptionally severe second wave. It is abated, but not gone. We have dealt with unprecedented economic stress, experienced severe social disruptions and distress, and have been dealing with the unknown and the uncertain in this period. We've had to deal with this disruption, the disruption caused by the pandemic in different sectors. The Prime Minister, however, said earlier this week, and I'm quoting him, disruption does not have to be in despair. Instead, we must keep the focus on the twin foundations of prepare and prepare. Unquote. In the last 1 year, we have seen a great collective effort overcome the challenges that we are facing. Our scientists have produced vaccines and know more about the virus and the dangers it poses. Businesses have adapted, as you mentioned, reboot, reimagine, and reform. Our economic and logistical systems have withstood extreme stress, and technology has enabled the creation of new paradigms in education, social equation, and commerce. At a broader diplomatic level, we have seen a keener awareness of the uncertainty that pervades the entire global system. The uncertainty has altered geopolitical and geoeconomic conduct. Speaking recently, External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar spoke of the dimensions along which perceptions and calculations of nations have changed as a result of the pandemic. And these include trust and transparency, heightened risk aversion, the awareness that global scale capacities are needed to deal with pandemic scale challenges, and decentralization and de-risking of globalization. Confidence in globalization has taken a hit. What is often termed as the global system, for lack of a better word, is seen as inadequate to the challenges posed by the pandemic. In fact, to some, globalization has become part of the problem. It is seen as a vulnerability. One particular element of the globalized world, global value chains and supply chains, has acquired prominence, not just in business circles, but also at the political level. There is a general belief that these chains have caused dependencies. These dependencies may have, wittingly or unwittingly, become weaknesses. These new vulnerabilities and challenges have altered the diplomatic environment. We often hear that the pandemic has accelerated already visible trends. Even before the pandemic struck, we were part of an increasingly more complex and globalized international system with many moving parts. It is also a system in rapid transition. Diplomacy has traditionally been about control over territory, populations, and resources. These were the determinants of national power. Science and technology and the Industrial Revolution introduced economic factors, such as markets and finance into foreign policy calculations. Geoeconomics intersected with geopolitics. This combination and the Cold War divide drove much of diplomacy after the Second World War. The fall of the Berlin Wall settled the Cold War. The digital revolution and new technologies have added a new axis of geotechnology to the intersection of geopolitics and geoeconomics. National power today is more about technology and about systems and processes rather than territory. We also inhabit a world in which centers of diplomatic gravity are in very rapid transition. For the first time in centuries, Asia is beginning to drive the global economy. Politically, the bipolar order that prevailed during the Cold War gave way to a unipolar system following the collapse of the Soviet Union. A further transition is underway as this unipolar world order moves to a multipolar system. The rise of China has also placed us in a central role as a geopolitical state. China is the largest neighbor and one with whom we share more than just a border and proximity. We have also had to confront the specific strategic challenge posed by the rise of China and its tactics on our shared border. We are at the core of a greater Asian and Indo-Pacific space that is witnessing dynamic change. Completely new threats and security challenges such as terrorism, climate change, and biological and other non-traditional threats have emerged and continue to emerge. New technologies have created both new industries and new political currents. Non-traditional threats and new technologies have combined to form a whole new spectrum of sub-conventional security challenges. As a ministry, we are faced with the rapidly changing geopolitical and geoeconomic environment, even as we cope with very complicated tactical requirements. A pandemic of this nature, as we have all realized, requires not just a whole of government approach, but a whole of society approach. It also requires us to source solutions and capacities on a global basis. The Ministry of External Affairs, like the entire government of India, adapted to respond to the new realities of the pandemic. Our ministry created a de novo vertical, the COVID cell, that worked 24/7 to coordinate our COVID-related operations. This was resourced appropriately with some of our best, and I must say, some of our youngest officers, and was able to scale up rapidly on demand. Our network of diplomatic missions played a key role in organizing the Vande Bharat mission, the largest logistical mission of its type ever undertaken. This is to repatriate Indian citizens who were stranded as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic all over the world. And this has facilitated so far the movement of more than 7 million people through lockdowns and post-lockdown periods. Indian HADR operations, which are complex interagency operations requiring detailed planning and efficient execution, acquired global dimensions with the deployment of rapid response teams. Some of our partner countries in the Maldives, Kuwait, Mauritius, and Comoros, and with Mission Sagar to the Maldives, Mauritius, Madagascar, Comoros, and Seychelles. India also supplied healthcare products to over 150 countries in the face of daunting logistical challenges. The MEA, the Ministry of External Affairs, has acted as the global arm of the Government of India's empowered group system to procure essential medical supplies for COVID-19. We have, throughout the pandemic, identified and connected with potential suppliers of essential medical equipment across the world. During the first COVID wave last year, a global sourcing operation was launched to procure ventilators, PPE kits, N95 masks, testing kits, and other essential requirements. This helped us tide over the situation till domestic manufacturing scaled up to meet demand. We also intervened to source medical products, machinery, and components that were vital for enhancing our domestic manufacturing capability. The MEA facilitated the import of components for ventilators, testing inputs such as RNA extraction kits, Roche Cobas testing machines, and testing kits from the US, Germany, China, Switzerland, and Singapore. Give some examples. Our missions abroad, where required, also reached out to original suppliers in various countries to expedite shipments of critical items. This effort to procure essential medical supplies intensified during the second wave. We are all aware of the suddenness and the extent of the wave. And in order to respond appropriately, we work closely with other ministries and agencies, armed forces, state governments, to coordinate a massive procurement and logistical operation to secure supplies of critical items. The immediate need during the second wave was to ramp up oxygen supply in thousands of our hospitals spread across the country. One of the challenges was to transport medical oxygen to the places of need from distant places of production within India. MEA and our diplomatic missions reached out to suppliers and governments and arranged cryogenic tankers, which helped with quick transportation of medical oxygen within the country. As I said, from the places of manufacture to the areas in our country that required this oxygen. Our missions in the Gulf countries worked with the Indian Navy for the supply of medical oxygen from those countries, which was transported by the naval ships. Our missions worked with the Indian Air Force in arranging the airlift of cryogenic tankers from Southeast Asia and other areas of the world. We also facilitated the supply of oxygen plants, a large number of oxygen cylinders and concentrators from governments and private organizations. We facilitated the procurement of critical drugs such as remdesivir, tocilizumab, amphotericin B. There's a whole range of names with which we've all acquired a certain level of familiarity. When the demand for remdesivir shot up in the country, we had to ensure that our domestic manufacturing capacity for this vital drug was significantly augmented. This required enhanced supplies of raw materials which were facilitated by our missions from diverse locations: US, Europe, China, Japan. Another example is tocilizumab, which is not currently manufactured in India. Roche Pharma, which is the sole supplier of the drug, was the company that we reached out to through our mission, and through consistent efforts ensured that the supply to India was increased by as much as 60% within a period of time over the last year. We also scouted for alternate sources and were able to get supplies, foreign assistance. We were able to secure supplies of antibody cocktails from Roche. Another important aspect of our efforts was to facilitate supplies of essential raw materials and components. For instance, the CSIR, the DRDO, and several of their industry partners who provided assistance in procuring zeolite molecular seeds, which is a critical component of oxygen generators and plants. We're trying to create a domestic capacity for an enhanced production of oxygen within the country, liquid medical oxygen. India received extensive support and assistance from its partner countries around the world during the second wave of the crisis. This reflected the goodwill that had been earned by us in the form of assistance extended to other countries when they needed it. The COVID cell within NDA handled the complexities associated with the deliveries of foreign support in close collaboration with other stakeholders in the government of India and the state governments. This COVID cell facilitated the arrival and distribution of critical items such as liquid medical oxygen, oxygen cylinders and concentrators, oxygen plants, medicines, and other equipment received from our partner countries. Our embassies in Russia and the United States facilitated discussions with major vaccine manufacturers for procurement and possible local manufacturing of their vaccines. For example, we have been involved in the introduction of Sputnik V into India. Vaccines have complex supply chains. We have worked to ease regulatory disruptions to these supply chains by diplomatic interventions with some of our key partners. We've adapted rapidly to virtual diplomacy. This is a product of our current constraints. Our high-level engagements in the bilateral, unilateral, and multilateral levels have continued in the virtual mode. In recent months, the Prime Minister has participated in a number of major summits. The last of it was the G7 summit. We had the India-EU summit. We had the first Quad Leaders Summit. We had the Leaders Summit on Climate Change. These engagements have been accompanied by regular virtual and telephonic conversations with leaders of partner countries, including the United States, Russia, UK, and Japan. Talking about the last 2 months, Indian diplomacy, as you can see, is adjusting to this complex and uncertain environment. It is doing so with agility and flexibility. We have to think and act innovatively and to adapt at the conceptual and operational levels. The challenge before us is to create capacities to deal with the unexpected and catastrophic events of the kind that we are currently witnessing. We have to be able to repurpose organizations at short notice to deal with unexpected challenges. Existing hierarchies and structures are often unable to cope with such challenges and may require re-engineering. The larger diplomatic operating environment has become immeasurably more complex. Diplomatic calculations earlier were made on the basis of ideological binaries of fairly straightforward balance of power equations. Today's environment is highly complex, multi-layered and multi-dimensional. Binaries and simple equations have been, to use an analogy, replaced by complicated algorithms. We must, in an environment such as this, build the capacities that allow us to maintain decision autonomy. We must focus on acquiring a leadership role that allows us to both participate in and contribute to the emerging world order. We must deepen cooperation with old partners and allies. We must, at the same time, forge new partnerships with rising powers. We must have a dynamic and proactive global strategy in a multipolar world that adjusts to alliances and convergences that are fluid and issue-based. We must engage simultaneously with multiple centers of gravity and capacity in an increasingly complex and fast-moving global scenario. But this is also a time of opportunity, as the title of our discussion today indicates. Empirically speaking, all crises are succeeded by periods of growth. The Great Depression and the Second World War were followed by one of the greatest sustained spurts of economic growth. A similar trend was observed after all of the four major recessions in the post-Second World War era. Major health crises have led to investments in medical science and public health that have transformed our lives. Foreign direct investment inflows into India during the last pandemic ravaged year were the highest ever at $81 billion. In other words, we received more last year when we were locked down for a good part of the year than we have received in any other year. India is home to one of the world's largest startup ecosystems. Several unicorns have come up in recent years. The world has gone online. The present interaction between us, workplaces, public institutions like courts, education institutions, social events have moved all of us to virtual space. Virtual reality, augmented reality, and other such technologies will further transform our lives and the manner in which we work and interact with each other. I would like to focus on three specific aspects or areas where India at this point, to use business terminology, has a value proposition. The first is the opportunity created by the ongoing transition to a knowledge economy. Output in such an economy will be driven as much by new technologies and digital processes as it is driven by agriculture and goods and services. The transition to a virtual world that I referred above points towards not just transformation, but a very rapid transformation. New and emerging technologies such as blockchains, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced materials, advanced manufacturing, genetics, and biotechnology will create new superpowers. We are already aware of the power of data. A country like India, with its emphasis on education and innovation, is well placed to take advantage of this transformation. The second opportunity will arise due to the requirement of de-risking and diversifying supply chains. I've spoken earlier of the requirement for trust and transparency. Businesses are trying to create secure and stable supply chains that will be able to deal with pandemic-level shocks. A number of conversations, such as the joint India-Australia-Japan Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, are taking place. The first World Leaders Summit, virtual summit in March, discussed supply chain resilience. A third area of opportunity is in climate. Climate change is one of the defining challenges of our time. India is amongst the front rank of nations with climate ambition. Despite our development challenges, we have taken major initiatives in the areas of clean energy, energy efficiency, afforestation, and biodiversity. India will not just meet its Paris commitment targets, but we will exceed them. According to Climate Action Tracker, India is the only G20 country with the 2-degree compatible target. The Climate Change Performance Index 2021 that tracks climate protection performance ranks India as a high-performing country. Energy is at the center of India's ambition and agenda. Massive investments have been made in augmenting India's renewable power capacity. 24% of India's installed capacity comes from renewable energy, such as the sun, wind, bio sources, and small hydro projects. In absolute terms, India ranks in the top 5 globally when it comes to power generation from these renewable energy sources. India has, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, installed solar power capacity at a faster rate than that of the United Kingdom and China in the last 5 years. They have set an ambitious renewable energy target of 450 gigawatts by 2030. We take the issue of land degradation seriously. We are working towards restoring 26 million hectares of degraded land by 2030. This is an announcement made by the Prime Minister during his recent intervention in the desertification summit just a couple of days ago. This would contribute to India's commitment to achieve an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Over the last 10 years, around 3 billion hectares of forest cover has been added. This has enhanced the combined forest cover to almost 1/4 of the country's total area. The two major global initiatives supported by India, the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, are emerging as useful platforms for cooperative action in the areas of climate change. This transition to a climate resilient economy will generate economic output and place the country on a sustainable growth path. A green economy makes for good economics, and India is in the path of creating a green economy. Speaking at the Raisina dialogue earlier this year, the Prime Minister had said, and I quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic has presented us with an opportunity to reshape the world order and to shape our thinking. We must create systems that address the problems of today and challenges of tomorrow. And we must think of the entire humanity, not merely of those who are on our side of the borders." Unquote. Looking ahead, such principles must invariably define a post-pandemic world order. India has called for a reformed multilateralism, human-centric globalization. It is a globalization based on fairness, equality, and humanity. One that prioritizes people and our planet and our collective and sustainable prosperity. India is a constructive contributor to the efforts to create such an international order by sharing developmental experiences with partner countries in the global south, undertaking humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, particularly during the pandemic, through initiatives such as the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and by acting as a first responder and net security provider in its diplomatic environment. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. That was a very insightful speech, and the range of work is just overwhelming. Just to hear the kind of activities, the number of countries, just the whole, the kinds of things that the External Affairs Ministry has been involved in, especially during COVID. Thank you very much for taking the time to drive even more transparency in the work that you do. And I know that you've spoken about virtual diplomacy, and we hope that in this engagement with the industry, you'll find this as an opportunity to drive further the discussion on transparency and trust that the Foreign Minister also spoke about, which you just mentioned. Let me start with the first question that we have here, which sort of comes from the point that you made about the whole of government and the whole of society. You kind of sort of added to that point, the whole of society. And there's a question from Ajay Khanna, who said that what is MEA's role in the whole of government approach for addressing the challenge of the second wave of COVID-19 and likely, God forbid, a third wave? Now, how do you see that piece along with the whole of society?
Yeah, well, thank you, Smartya, and thank you, Ajay, for that question. Some of what you asked was responded in my statement. But just to put it in context, essentially, if you look at MEA as a global arm of the government of India, what we did was really coordinate, the sourcing of our requirements from outside our country. Now, when the second wave of the pandemic struck, no one could anticipate either the extent or the speed at which this wave would affect our country and really, in many senses, bring this sort of bring us to this unprecedented situation where we had, fairly serious gap between the demand, the sudden creation of demand, and the existing capacity by way of our health infrastructure. Now, if you look at it in perspective, at the peak of the first wave, we had 95,000 cases. The second wave, we had over 4 lakh cases. I mean, that's more than 4 times the number that we experienced at what we thought was the worst that COVID-19 could do, which is create about a 95,000 caseload. Obviously, that put enormous strains on our existing resources. And what was urgently needed was essentially 2 things. We needed oxygen, liquid medical oxygen, and we needed certain essential medicines like remdesivir. MEA was told to do whatever it takes. I mean, drop everything else, get down to trying to source these 2 essentials. And we did tell all our ambassadors, we said, while we are in this, we have our normal diplomatic engagement, that is what we normally do, but let's put all this aside and let's just focus on what we need within the country. And I think all our missions really worked very hard to try and ensure not only to identify sources of items that we needed, but also quickly ensure that these were procured. Take an example, liquid medical oxygen. Now, the problem was not just that we had to get liquid medical oxygen. The problem also was within the country. We do produce liquid medical oxygen, but the production centers are all located in the eastern part of India, Bengal and in Odisha. But it needed to be brought into where COVID was really prevalent, strongly in the west and northern parts of India. There were serious constraints because we found that we didn't have enough cryogenic tankers which actually bring these items across. So there was an imbalance between areas of production and the areas of demand. The second issue was how do you bring these items, even if you have liquid medical oxygen, how do you bring it into the country? You need the capacity to bring it in. We realized that internationally there wasn't that much capacity. The tankers to bring specialized tankers to bring in these this LMO into the country wasn't available beyond a certain minimum quantity. We also needed to bring in oxygen plants. Many of our hospitals were relying on supply in the normal course, which would come in through our regular sort of manufacturing. But actually, what was needed at this time was that we needed to create our own localized centers of production of oxygen, and therefore a priority on bringing in oxygen plants. Ultimately, 46 large oxygen plants are brought in from different parts of the world, attached to hospitals, and generating enough oxygen for very large hospitals to function independently. We also started the production of pressure swing absorption plants, which are basically plants that manufacture, create its own oxygen from the ambient environment. And for that, again, we had the capacity, DRDO, BEA, etc., to do these, but they needed essential medical. They needed the equipment. I mentioned zeolite seeds. These are needed in order for you to create oxygen, to create the plants that produce oxygen. So this had to be procured from different parts of the world. We also tied up with the Navy to send naval ships, but we needed specialized tankers that would be loaded onto the ship to bring oxygen. They brought oxygen directly to the west coast. So we had tankers bringing in oxygen, naval ships bringing oxygen to Goa, to Mumbai, to ports along our western coastline, right up to Kerala. On the eastern side, we were able to bring in, have our Air Force aircraft bring in supplies directly from Southeast Asia. But on the whole, in a short period of time, we're not talking about a long period, from mid-April till about early June, we brought in about 1,000 metric tons of oxygen. Our normal consumption of oxygen within the country in a month is about not even 1,000 metric tons of liquid medical oxygen. The requirement, of course, is shot up to almost 10,000 tons. But even bringing 1,000 tons on an urgent emergency basis did a lot to this, take care of the demand and to take the pressure off from our own domestic capacities, which is incidentally ramped up from about 1,000 to about 10,000 tons in a short period of time. Medicines is another thing. Remdesivir, for example, we had 5 manufacturers of remdesivir in the country. Licensed manufacturers in India. They produce 56,000 vials. Ajay would be well aware of that a day. We had to take that capacity up to 3 lakhs or 4 lakhs a day. And for that, we needed raw materials. I mean, nothing today in this interdependent world can be done. There's nothing which you manufacture completely exclusive. A lot of talk is there on vaccines, and I'm sure we'll come down to that later. But if you take a vaccine product, each vaccine that you create needs about 70 different inputs of raw materials that come from different parts of the world. So we are living in an interdependent world. We're living in a world where no one country can manage to make a product, not something as complicated as a vaccine dose or a dose of remdesivir without being dependent on other countries. That is why the issue of Brazilian supply chain is talked about. But remdesivir, for example, we managed to make sure that every single vial of remdesivir across the world, whether it's Egypt, the United States, Japan, any part of the world, was booked by us and bought it. We also got the raw materials needed from different parts of the world, really on a priority basis. And that's all we did in these 1.5 months. The whole of government that channelized this, but also the enormous internationalists. You had 53 countries that came up, and some countries, of course, had very huge operations to help us in this period when we really had this crisis, serious crisis of a shortage of these items. And plane loads of aircraft in India. A number of aircraft coming in each day, unloading this, but we needed a system here. We needed to make sure that there was a system that not only you had an interface with these countries well before they brought this in, but within our country we had a system. Now the MEA developed sort of a in-house digital platform that recorded each and every flight that came in, from which country it came in, each and every item that was brought in, where was it collected, and where was it going, more important. For example, an aircraft came in from the United States and brought in, say, 100 ventilators. Now, these ventilators, were, say, landed in Delhi, and they were taken from here. Where were they taken? They were taken to hospitals in Punjab, in Haryana, in Uttar Pradesh, in Rajasthan. Every hospital was traced. And we made sure that, those who were providing us with this assistance were fully kept informed that, your ventilators gone to these hospitals, this place, helping so on. We also went and made sure we had video clips and audio visual clips of as many of these consignments as possible, so that there was a trade, between the equipment that is received and how it is helping people on the ground. Oxygen generating plant, for example, I remember the one that came in, went to the ITBP hospital in Noida. We made sure that this was tracked right from the place where it came. The infrastructure was ready before it came in, just had to be installed and set up, and it was generating oxygen to help that hospital provide oxygen to so many people. The point I'm making is that it needed a huge organization, because the whole of government approach, all the concerned ministries and departments, the agencies worked very, very closely together. There was an interministerial clearinghouse every morning, every evening. There were lots of meetings at different levels, including the highest levels. But if you look at it in retrospect, I mean, we had a very difficult time. It was a harrowing time. I think there is no doubting the fact that one of the most difficult periods that our country has been through in recent time. But it was a short period of 1.5 months. We are today seeing the end of the second wave. We cannot be complacent, because it could be a third wave, it could be more waves after that. But what have we done? I think today we have created capacity. We have created capacities in terms of hospital capacity, we have created capacity in terms of equipment. Our own manufacturing capacities, the ability to produce that number of ventilators, our ability to produce medicines like remdesivir, our ability to make sure that we keep ramping this up, and we shouldn't really stop. The liquid medical oxygen, for example. Oxygen is normally used for industry. When it is required, it is used for medical oxygen. But that capacity of 10,000 tons that we have created should remain. In fact, we should expand that capacity. Not only that, as you're aware, under the PM CARES Fund, we have ensured that there is one PSA plant that generates oxygen in every district of it. So you want to make sure that you have localized means of producing your own liquid medical oxygen. God forbid there's a third wave or a fourth wave, you have far better place to deal with those exigencies and situations. MEA's role was to interface with the rest of the world. A lot of the equipment, a lot of the oxygen was purchased. Some of it came in as gifts from some of these countries, some from private entities and individuals. But all of it was important at a particular period of time to bridge the gap between demand and supply when we needed it. 1.5 months down the line, in early June, we assessed our requirement. We saw that the caseload had come down significantly. The demand in our hospitals had really shrunk. We told our friends, thank you, we appreciate it, but we are putting a stop to international assistance for these items. And even that international assistance was confined to just liquid medical oxygen and the medicines I mentioned. There's nothing else that we required in addition to these. So the stock of assistance is fine, but it was very specific assistance. It was very time bound. And today, I think that assistance, other than those supplies that were already planned in advance, have sort of now come to a stop. So we've been part of a larger system. We have worked within that system, but we have worked to provide that very essential support in our national efforts to our diplomatic interventions, our diplomatic linkages. We use cash in all our IOUs, use whatever leverages we have, whatever we did, to get equipment, to get the supplies, to get the required attention that we needed at the time that we needed. And that's, I think, where you could summarize MEA's role coming into this overall thing. You have to also realize that when there was a very strict lockdown, when half the ministry was, I mean, not half, but a very large number of our colleagues were down in hospital or COVID positive. We had a whole group of people who worked throughout this period, as I said, 24/7 to ensure that we did what we had to do. And I did tell all of our officers who came in day after day during the worst period of this COVID crisis with all the inherent risks that are involved, including my colleagues here. I said that I would make sure that it goes on a record that you have served selflessly and without any hesitation when the time came to do your bit for public service. So that's just to put it in context. I'm just trying. I might have over dramatized it, but I'm putting it in context for what sort of operations and what the MEA actually did on the ground and in contributing to this larger effort within this country.
And sir, I want to assure you on behalf of the delegates present today and the MC here that we remain deeply grateful for the work that the External Affairs Ministry has done. I was speaking to your colleague, the Defense Secretary, the other day, and he spoke with great fondness of the work that the Defense Service has done and the cooperation with the External Affairs. So the whole of government was actually seen in those 20 days. And I could also say that there wasn't a better time for you to cash into the goodwill that you had, which you spoke about. So thank you for everything you did. So we have a hard stop at 6:30. Would you have a few minutes? I just want to make sure.
No, absolutely. I'm okay as long as it's fine.
Okay. So I'll stop when you tell me to stop. I'm just going to go up with questions. You can give us, short responses. I have lots of questions. I'm going to try and cover as many as possible. There's another one which is now about taxation, the position that India has taken, G7 proposal in terms of minimum 15% corporate tax. There's also discussion in OECD around the equalization levy, which has been tagged as the question from Ishtiaq Ahmed and Rajiv Agarwal. They've asked this question on basically on India's approach to taxation, whether it's corporate or equalization levy. And so where do you think we are on that and how would we approach that?
Well, of course, the G7 took a lot of decisions, but I think one of the main concerns of the G7 was to ensure that it was responding to this unusual situation that we had. And in that context, I think they wanted to make sure that, the richest nations, which the G7 represents, is contributing not only to governments, but also their private sector. I think that the 15% corporate tax and that the equalization levy has to be seen in that context. G7 wanted to make sure that there was equal, let's say, stake taken by the private sector in contributing to the larger efforts, whether it is in the form of ensuring vaccine for the developing world, whether it is ensuring that there was debt service suspension initiative that was in place. Whatever was required, you need the financial backing, and this is one way to ensure that this came forward. We were, as part of the G7 summit, happy to go along with this. And I think from our perspective, these are unusual times, extraordinary times, and it requires, as I said, not just a whole of government approach, but a whole of society approach. Which means that we need contribution from all concerned. And the private sector, particularly, I think, has been coming forward to assist in many ways. And this is one way I think it's felt that this sort of a levy, sort of a tax would help the overall international.
Thank you, sir. Another continuation of that question is there are lots of questions that have come on India, China, as you can imagine. So I'm going to try and bring them together to ask you one, which is, do you see the India-China relationship going forward post the second wave as we move into the sort of end of this year and next year changing? There seems to be some initial business in terms of imports and COVID-related relief equipment, etc. Do you see that improving, changing? You've also spoken about the understanding that no country is fully equipped to do everything themselves, which means there is some interdependability. How do you see that going forward, sir?
Well, the situation with regard to, as I mentioned, China is the largest neighbor. We have obviously a fair amount of trade and economic linkages, and you mentioned interdependencies. When we talk about supply chains, we talk about raw materials for our own industry. Some of it, part of it also comes from China. And obviously, as with any other country, there are economic and other factors which form part of that relationship, make it an interdependent relationship. But I think the entire basis of that relationship has been predicated on having peace and tranquility on our borders. And after all, in 1988, when we decided to open a dialogue and formalize relations with China, it was based on sort of borders remaining settled as in, not creating an issue that would resonate on the larger relationship. We decided to isolate the border-related issues until we could sort of sit down and try and address them without impacting on the relationship. But we've always, and both sides have been fairly clear that the relationship, a normal relationship, is based on the border being peaceful and tranquil. And today that is not the case. And we've seen last year an unusual situation of multiple transgressions on the border areas. We have obviously seen this as a unilateral provocation. We have tried to deal with it in a manner that is through negotiations and through talks. And to some extent, we have, I think, addressed some of the issues that had arisen out of this situation that was created by China. But there are still friction points, and there are still issues that we need to continue to discuss. And we are very clear that until these issues are addressed and our border areas are peaceful and tranquil, we will not be able to go into what is called a normal trajectory of relation. I think that was the question. As we go forward, how do you see that situation evolving? And I think we will have to be guided by the progress and the level of cooperation willingness that we see on the part of China in how we take issues forward. Obviously, the fact is that we need to work on it. We have to see how to. We are obviously looking at resolving the issue as I'm sure in the case also regarding China. But as I said, it really depends. The onus is on China to ensure that the issues that remain are addressed before we take forward into what is normal.
Thank you. The China question has to be followed by a US question. So I'm going to turn to a US question, which is here from my colleague Harish Krishnan, but I think also from a lot of other people that's on the list of questions that have been asked, which is The US-India strategic relationship has always been strong. It's over a decade now. You could go back to all the way to Mr. Clinton, or whichever you want to look at it. That's just gone from strength to strength. Their focus now is also a lot on environment issues. On the sort of Mr. Kerry was here, so all that is is clearly seen. Do you think that the trade relationship between India and US, which this group of delegates believes and sort of is deeply concerned about, can sort of come up to that speed, not just investment, but the overall trade relationship, the trust in investments, the sort of back and forth between the two countries, in addition to the people-to-people strategic dialogue, defense dialogue? How do we get the trade to its full potential? We've talked about a large number. We haven't gotten there. What is it that we can do? What is it External Affairs thinks of it?
Well, I mean, having been on that side of things, handling diplomatic relations with the US,
Yeah.
I think one thing is, if you look at it over the last 10 years, we have made very significant progress in bilateral trade. We have recorded year-on-year increases in trade at about an average of 10%. Despite various ups and downs in the global economic situation, the trade relationship has remained between India and the United States remained quite stable and quite encouraging. Of course, there is a lot more that you can do to take it to its fullest potential, because you can do more than compared to today. I think we have been speaking about a limited free trade agreement, followed by a more comprehensive agreement that would cover a larger range of items. But our idea was to first look at a limited deal that would allow us to go in for those areas that could be very easily sort of incorporated into a sort of. And in the meantime, of course, we had a change in administration. We had very good, as I mentioned earlier, good conversations with the new administration. We had a number of occasions in which the Prime Minister has spoken to President Biden, most recently the interaction with the G7, but also at a personal bilateral level. We had an External Affairs Minister down in the US recently, had very extensive conversations across the board, including US businesses, chambers of commerce. We had Secretary of Defense, General Austin, who came down with made his first visit here. See President Biden's first interaction was with the port leader. Spoke about that's where he spoke about resilient supply chains, spoke about economic cooperation. So I think we have the basis to look at how to now address or rather create the framework for an enhanced trade relationship. So it takes some time with the new administration, but I think we're getting to a point where we can look at providing an impetus to the trade front. And I think the elements are there. We need to sit down, and our Commerce Minister is already in touch with the US, the new US State Representative. They've spoken about the need to sit down and look at, more sort of creating a framework for trade momentum provided. So I think we are getting there, and we're getting to a point in which we can really come to what you're saying, and that is how can we provide serious impetus to the ongoing trade relationship.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to a question related to COVID and vaccines. This is from Vinita Sethi. Following the vaccine nationalism, now there's this whole issue of vaccine passports that could make international travel somewhat complex and discourage international, because of who's got vaccine and who hasn't and which vaccine. It also seems WHO last month took a stand against introduction of COVID-19 vaccination proofs as a requirement. How is India preparing for the challenge? More specifically, how are we working towards facilitating mobility of people across our people? What is our view of this vaccine passport? Are we engaging? Do we think this will be the way that the future will develop, or are we sort of, because our numbers, as you know, are currently low, but I suppose by December they will go up reasonably. Where do you think this is headed? Your view, sir?
Well, if you look at it, we've done about 270 billion. We've administered 270 billion vaccines to our citizens. We are probably among, in terms of sheer volume, among the countries that have achieved the highest let's say, output in terms of vaccines delivered. But obviously, we do recognize we have a long way to go in reaching universal vaccination. We are looking at about 950 million people. So if you look at it, we have a fair amount of ground to cover. We do believe that we have the basis to cover this by the end of the year, because we have our own domestic production is ramped up. We are looking at significantly enhanced availability of vaccine for the rest of the year. And I think we will be in a fairly good position in terms of the immunization of our own population. But our approach hasn't been to look at it simply from that point of view. I mean, we are looking at it, look at it from a global perspective. So far, only 0.3% of the population in Africa has been vaccinated. Very small percentage of people in the developing world have been vaccinated. So far, vaccination has been a prerogative and privilege, prerogative of the privilege. And I think that fact came out in G7 also, that wealthier countries that garnered most of the resources. And today, to talk about vaccine passports, would be able to say that if you're more privileged, you can travel, but if you're not, then your mobility is limited. So, irrespective of whether we are in that happy position of being immunized or not, I think our position, this is something we did, Vice Minister did take it up to the G7 also, is that we really feel that the protocol to allow travel should be based on what exists, which is the RT-PCR negative test, to ensure that the person is not positive, COVID positive, that he's not got any risk, he doesn't pose any risk to the country that he's going to, but to base it on whether you got vaccinated or not, I think would be discriminatory and would really to large extent eliminate good part of the developing world from travel anywhere. So we are a little reluctant to hit that. It is not a question of any other factor. I mean, I think all of our indigenous vaccines will receive emergency authorizations within the country, within internationally, through WHO and others. That's not going to be a problem. I think we will also have a good number of our nationals vaccinated. But in principle, I think the issue of vaccine passport should be looked at from the point of view of the equitable international order. And that's how I think we would think of it.
Thank you for the indulgence of extra time. I'll try and close this by 6:40, about 7-8 minutes more, about 2 or 3 questions that I have. One of them is from my colleague Raman Sidhu, who says that the European industries welcome the resumption of the India-EU FTA discussions. The Business Leaders Summit in May in Porto exhibited positive business sentiments. Obviously, the industry would be happy to support a broad-based trade agreement, an investment agreement, in fact. However, it needs a clear roadmap between India and EU to ensure a clear, structured engagement and dialogue with the industry is put in place. Would you shed some light on what is being envisaged by the government in this direction?
Well, we've been working with the European Union for quite some time to consider the possibility of an investment agreement between India and EU. And the fact that the two, we have decided to proceed with this and to start discussions on this, I think is a very important step. It's a good step. It came at the summit that the Prime Minister had with the EU heads of state and government. As you know, that the Prime Minister was to travel to Portugal with the current president of the European Union, where he was supposed to meet all 27 heads of state and government of the European Union at one go. The India-EU summit. It's quite been an unprecedented event. Because of COVID, obviously, in-person meeting could not take place, but this was arranged virtually. And one of the outcomes was the decision to proceed with the India-EU investment agreement. And we do have, I think Raman is right in saying that we need structured industry level talks as well. I think we do have, through our industry associations, regular contact with European chambers and businesses. We probably need to do a lot more of that in order to reach that point where we can conclude this agreement. This has a lot of priority from our side. We will try and push this through as quickly as we can, and we take heart from the fact that people involved in this and very much in the know are also in favor of getting this.
Thank you, sir. A question from Sanjay Singh said, we believe Afghanistan is about to open up investments in the mining sector, particularly lithium, which has an abundance so crucial for India's EV vision. In view of the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, how safe would it be for Indian companies to start entering the mining sector in Afghanistan, he asks, and will the Afghanistan government, in your view, be able to provide protection to the Indians' investments there? There's some other questions around Afghanistan because of the withdrawal of troops and Indian businesses. I just wanted to get a broad view rather than combining all those questions together.
Well, Afghanistan really today is in a very, let's say, a situation of uncertainty with the US withdrawal on the one hand, and the Taliban migration on the other. Seeing that the Taliban has been steadily expanding its let's say, operations in Afghanistan through targeted assassinations as well as territorial aggression. And I think, the levels of, I would say, violence and the fact that, despite talks going on in Qatar and other places, their relentless pursuit of power through violence has made it an uncertain environment in many senses. India has always been, for a peaceful solution. We've always called for a ceasefire. We've always advocated that there should be talks between the government and the Taliban and others that are involved in this process, involving all the neighboring countries. Many of those talks are on, but as I said, the situation is fluid and uncertain, and at this point of time, it's very difficult to say how things would work out. The fact of the matter is that there have been some investments, in the mining sector. They've been dogged by various uncertainties, which are only increasing, not decreasing. We hope the time will come when companies can go in and invest and realize their return on investments appropriately when there is peace and stability in the country. Needless to say, that is something that we are definitely perfectly hoping for as a neighbor and friend of Afghanistan, and the people of Afghanistan. But as I said, the situation today is very fluid, and obviously, had a large number of US and coalition forces that have maintained a certain amount of stability. When they pull out, it creates an environment of uncertainty. We have to watch and see how this.
Thank you, sir. My last question for the evening is from pharma companies. Neelima Dwivedi, my colleague at the MC, asks whether she says several global pharma companies are seeking to provide equitable access of their innovative drugs through voluntary licensing in India. She's interested to hear your thoughts on how the government can build a supportive policy ecosystem that not just enables, but encourages transparency and predictability so that more companies feel encouraged to provide broader access of innovative drugs for Indian patients. A very relevant question as the government turns its thoughts to medical policies and sort of health policy, in this day and age.
Yeah, certainly, I think the pharma sector, health sector is one that assumes a great deal of importance in today's context. And as I mentioned in my intervention earlier, what we really are looking at is building up of our health capacities, health infrastructure capacities, but also manufacturing capacities that make it possible not only to meet enhanced demand. By enhanced demand, I mean in unusual circumstances that we witnessed, for example, during the second wave of the COVID crisis, and to be able to sustain it. Take the case of remdesivir, where I mentioned that our production increased least 3 to 4 times from the normal demand that is there. Today, that demand has come down domestic. But I did, contact our pharmaceutical ministry, and I said that we have orders from Indonesia, for example. Many other countries have orders with us. Let's take remdesivir off our banned list, put it in a restricted list, and see whether we can export this surplus quantities. And I think there was a very good appreciation of that factor, that we should be supple and we should be flexible to move from a period of deficit to surplus, and then to be able to use it in a manner that is conducive and for all concerned, including countries that need it most at this point of time. So, as a country that believes in developing its pharmaceutical industry, I think it is also incumbent on us to be able to attract, the latest, developments in the pharmaceutical sector, the latest drugs, getting the best treatment possible that is there. And I think that enabling environment is something that we do have. We've not been in a position where we call the pharmaceutical world. But obviously there are, you can always improve on what you have, and there is more you can do to ensure that those companies, pharmaceutical majors that are looking at India for, to bring in their latest, let's say, products, I think is something that we should. I mean, we've had a long conversation many of the US manufacturers on issues like stents and other areas. And I think this is one of those that we really also need to continue to have, that we must be ready to welcome investments, we must be ready to welcome the latest in medical science. At the same time, we should be in a position to capitalize this and also take this outside ready.
Thank you, sir. I have to say it's been a great privilege to have hosted you today. If I had to sum up what you said, it'd be virtually impossible. The kind of work that the ministry has done, your colleagues, obviously over and beyond the call of duty, putting their personal lives and that of their families at risk, is an incredible effort, which is no less than what our soldiers and officers sort of face at the border. Just to, their lives were really at threat, and they still continue to be at work. We know how many of your colleagues had sort of fallen to COVID, and we are thankful that most of them have recovered and they're back. This enormous effort that you described did not come without a price. We are acutely aware of that. We're also aware of the new focus that you've spoken about, your incredible trust in technology and using technology to drive both trust and transparency that clearly has come through what the foreign minister has said. And I'll sort of end by saying that we should go back to what you first said, which is what the Prime Minister also mentioned, which is the way to sort of sum up as we come out of this wave, this terrible period that we've had the last few months, which is disruption does not mean despair. Thank you for holding the sort of candle to that point. It really does point to that, gives us great hope. And again, this group of delegates in the nation remains indebted to the outstanding work that you and your colleagues have done during this period. Thank you very much. Namaskar.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Bye-bye. Thank you.